So this actually raises, because we are an educational institution, we need to spend a lot of time talking about, in some ways, what do we do about this? So I want to get to, the issues of kind of both democratic citizenship writ large and then the classroom as like the two last questions that I wanted to ask both of you. But before I do that, I just also think, as Danielle, you were talking, I think that there were, in the last probably decade, there's a lot of people that fell in love with market forces. And in some ways, as you were talking, I was thinking about, because market forces, like in a place where we were just in yesterday, McDowell County, West Virginia, where we lead a public-private partnership, market forces abandoned that community. Market forces have abandoned many of the communities that voted for Obama and then voted for Trump, and where people felt like, well, the government did not do what we believed was promised to, in some ways, disrupt those market forces. But this whole notion of the reason, and this gets into my next question, but the reason I asked the question about populism is that what we have actually witnessed, I think, with President Trump is the hijacking of words that meant something else to many of us. The rigged economy, populism. And what we've actually seen, or what I've actually tried to do, and I'm glad you raised the social contract, is to actually talk about the contrast in terms of Trump running as a populist but governing for the elite, and trying to actually think about that contrast in terms of the hypocrisy of it, and looking at, which is one of the reasons I raised, Tim's podcast about pseudo-populism, because we go back to even the book that I think Tom Franks wrote about What's the Matter with Kansas, which was attempting to, in some ways, answer that same question. And I do think, as progressives, I'll just say it for myself, I think that the union and other progressive institutions, we actually have to grapple with this, because we have to grapple with the first comment you made, Danielle, which is, how do we actually reconnect with the American people writ large, as opposed to saying that you were wrong, but trying to figure out how to deal with this as we're, how to deal with the economic issues and how to try to explain it, teach it, which is what makes education even that much more important. So on the two education questions, I want to think about education for adults first, and then education for kids. We often do it the other way, but again, it raises, it raises a question. Both what I love about both of these scholars is that they've actually been teaching adults, not just teaching students, in terms of what democracy and democratic citizenship mean in this period of time. So, I would argue, if Leo and I were still teaching in school and teaching our juniors and seniors, we would talk about how democratic citizenship is essential to preserving and nurturing democracy. We would talk about, frankly, in our classes, how voting was a sacred right, or is a sacred right and responsibility of every citizen, and the government's job is to promote the broadest possible involvement of citizenry in the elections. You notice I'm reading this because I have to stick to my notes here, and that would create that kind of confidence, something that I think Tim has already said, yes, that is the aspiration, and we would be teaching in high schools that aspiration. And there would be, even when I was teaching in the 1990s, there would still be a consensus about that aspiration. This was well before all of the voting suppression of this generation. What's interesting now is that the age of political polarization is now the lens through which everyone looks at everything. As a result, even when you start talking about wanting more people to vote, which is what we used to teach, that is now a political issue, not a democracy issue. As we see with the voter suppression panel, as we saw with all the gerrymandering. So you actually, Danielle, you've kind of written the book on this, on American citizenship after Brown, and you talk about the ability to talk to strangers, which is what you said at the beginning. And that really matters. So, how do you help us navigate through this age of polarization the importance of democratic citizenship?
So it's a really hard, deep question, and I think one of the challenges is the need to work on so many different levels at once. And so the one key question is how to achieve the division of labor that makes that possible. So at some level, I think in communities across the country, we do actually just need to be rebuilding cross-ideological alliances for, at the bare minimum, problem exploration. Like, forget about solution for the moment. Could we even imagine cross-ideological problem exploration conversations? And there are people who are working on this. There's a guy named Bill Doherty running a program called Better Angels, which actually started a few years before the election, but it's exploded since then. And it's, he's trained as a psychologist and family therapist, and they build projects that bring together people who are on opposite sides of a divide, not always partisan. So for example, they have one program, I think in Minneapolis, that brings together police officers and black men who have a lot of exposure to the police. And it takes a lot to build up the trust that makes it possible to begin to actually do meaningful problem solving. But I think we do actually just need an expansion of efforts like that on the one hand. I know of another group of people in Ohio working on something called the Shared Values Initiative, which is an effort, again, to build workshops that bring together people from divergent positions around the basic concepts of liberty and justice for all. What does that actually connect to? When you look at the world around you and see things that are wrong with it, why do those things that are wrong register in terms of the idea of, or how do they register in terms of liberty and justice for all, with the justice for all idea being an equality idea alongside the liberty idea? That's kind of very rudimentary, right? Sort of beginning to rebuild there. Then I think the other thing that's incredibly important is converting technocracy into leadership. Actually, and that's sort of working with adults at a different spectrum. It's working with folks who have PhDs or are sitting in managerial positions and so forth, and breaking up the complacency of their own professionalization, exposing them to people whose knowledge bases are built up quite differently, and requiring them to take seriously the kinds of learning people get from working day after day in, a methadone clinic or something of the sort. That is a much deeper sort of practitioner, quote unquote professional networks of collaboration than we've had for a while. Those are all very nitty gritty things, but the point I'm trying to make is I think that the sort of adult part of the education has to be about rebuilding, cross-class alliances, rebuilding a capacity to do problem solving, problem identification, across boundaries of difference and so forth. And then I think if we can get that going, say 5 years worth of activity spreading around the country of that kind, then you start to have more capacity to talk about things like voting again and so forth, and work on that collectively and not have that fall into a polarized partisan trap.
Wow. Thank you. You've also, I think about what you've written in terms of kind of castigating alternative facts, and that kind of, I love that kind of, and exposing, some of the hypocrisies here. But how do you wrote this book to actually, just like Danielle talked about when she had a whole bunch of colleagues say to her, what do we do about this? In some ways, the question that you're answering, at least in my judgment, when you wrote this book, was to think about how to get people to do something. But how do you think about democratic citizenship in this age of political polarization where, we're just kind of our sense of the common good has been frayed?
Let me try to answer that by summarizing some things that I think we've said already, and then maybe saying one new thing. Let me start with an anecdote, which is Twitter and text to vote. So I'm not sure how many of you were caught up in Twitter telling you that you can text to vote. This was a Russian operation which was designed to prevent Americans from voting by using bots which sent out tweets to Americans saying, hey, you can text to vote, you don't have to go to the polls, right? And this was so pervasive that Twitter's idea about the world is that like the truth always rises to the top so long as there's enough exchange, which was like totally naive when Milton said it, and like already impossible to believe when John Stuart Mill said it, and just one of these like very silly liberal ideas. But Twitter's idea is that we're never going to comment on stuff that people say because the truth will always rise to the top. In this case, even Twitter had to intervene because there was so much of this text to vote, right? This was a foreign intervention in our electoral process, but let's put that to the side. What does it say about us? What does it say about us that when we hear, oh, I can text to vote, I would rather do that, right? I'd rather do that. Now, the cynics among you may be saying, well, I guess this is true of my district in New Haven too. I didn't want to wait for 3 hours in line, okay? But I'm trying to make a different point, which is that voting is one of the very few times we actually get our bodies out to do anything which involves the country, if we're typical. And it seems to me that a common thread in some of the questions and some of Danielle's answers has had to do with precisely that, like that you have to get your body out and do something. That these conversations about what we might have in common, recognizing problems, as Danielle said, even if we don't know solutions, that requires a face-to-face conversation. It just doesn't happen over the internet. You can get people out on the street with the internet, you can do cool stuff with the internet, but you can't have that kind of conversation. And I think the reason, and this is a very old-fashioned point, which goes back to some of the philosophical traditions that Danielle cites, the reason for that has to do with recognition. You have to see the other person and recognize them as a human being. And so one of the things which has happened to us, which has made all of this much more difficult, and it gets to the polarization and the question of what it means to be a citizen, is that it's just much easier to not recognize somebody as a human being if you're on the internet. It's just, and the average American spends 10 hours and 48 minutes in front of a screen every day. So what are we actually doing? Right? If you put those, if you take those 11 hours out and then like 5 hours for sleeping, and if you're me, 5 hours for getting your kids ready to school in the morning, like how much time do you have left in a day, right? For actual normal interaction with people. And I make this as a very serious point. Like the Twitter thing is just one little example. And this goes to the question about economics. I'm going to pick up Danielle's theme about economics. The last time we had a globalization, and this is what happens when you invite historians will say, well, this already happened once, and we learned the lessons, and then we forgot them. But with globalization, it's true. We had a globalization. It lasted from the 1870s into the 1930s. It blew up the first time. In the first globalization, people said exactly the same things that people say in this globalization, or said. They said, growth is going to lead to enlightenment, fanaticism is going to go away, nationalism is a passing phase, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Chapter and verse, people said the same stuff in the 1890s, as they said, in the 1990s. And then we learned a lesson. Even the economists learned a lesson, right? The lesson the economists learned in the 1930s, and John Maynard Keynes was the most important in this, was that everybody has a lifespan. People get sick. People are shocked when there's a Great Depression. It's not just a matter of the numbers, it's a matter of the experiences. And so if you're going to be a good economist, you have to take into account that you're dealing with people, right? People who are at some point on a specific life, and you have to then, political economy means setting up the economy so that shocks to the numbers don't have to be shocks to everybody, right? We learned that once, and that's the sadness of where we are now, is that we've forgotten that human tradition in economics. And I mean, there's a fundamental point here which goes to education. And I mean, again, I'm trying to summarize some themes here. What the economists assume, and what the libertarians, who are very important in American political discussions, assume, is that there's this thing called an individual, and that individual makes rational decisions. Like, that individual is just out there, right? You just start from the assumption that there is that individual. And I mean, anybody who's ever done any teaching or parenting or anything, or anybody who has ever been a child, knows that this is not true, right? You were not, when you were 4, you were not the individual of Economics 101. You were not making rational decisions about your priorities and so on. You were not spending your money rationally. I mean, my kid who's 7 has a wallet. I mean, he does not behave the way that you should behave according to Economics 101. It's going to take a lot of work, right?
You should see my 7-year-old. My 7-year-old will take your 7-year-old's money.
Yeah. That has already happened. He has that friend. And I'm like joking sort of, I'm like, yeah, you just learned your lesson. Yeah. Money's important, you see. Anyway, where was I going with this? But see, this is the paradox of American political conversation. The whole point of education, is to create those individuals. You have to create them. It takes a huge amount of collective investment, work, contact, money to create individuals in the first place. And where we've gotten ourselves to in our national conversation in the last 25 years is that we just assume those individuals are out there, and they're not. Creating them is the national task. If you want to have a nation, you have to invest in education to create the individuals. And that's what we've punted on, I think, in the last quarter century. And so for all those economists and all those libertarians whose emphasis on individualism, in some sense, I agree with. I think we should be trying to become individuals. It takes a hell of a lot of work. You can't just postulate it, right? You can't just postulate that Americans are individuals who think rationally about their interests. You got to make those people. You got to make them. You got to make them happen. Now, I'm going to say one thing about truth. And again, it gets to some of the philosophical traditions that show up in Danielle's work. We need truth a lot more than we think. Just lying at people, laughing when people get things wrong isn't enough, or even calling it hypocrisy is not enough. There's a generic boundary here between fiction and reality. And it's not that I'm always right or that Mr. Trump is always wrong, but there is a difference. And the difference is that Mr. Trump lives in fiction, right? He doesn't actually lie. His reality is untruth. It's not possible for him to lie. It's not a lie. To him, it's not a lie, right? He lives in fiction. And so for us to say, oh, well, like, you got that wrong, or, that was a mistake, or that was fine, that doesn't actually make sense. He's functioning as a fictional character. And you're not supposed to laugh, damn it. The whole point is that's a different political system, where the leader creates a legend which isn't verifiable by the data, right? Where the leader uses the language to create a literary product. That's a different political system than the one that we're in. Which means that if you want to defend the one that you're in, where we're all supposed to be individuals, you have to create a little sort of bubble or cocoon of factuality around yourself, right? Like, that's your job, is to create this little shell of factuality around yourself, not just to react to what looks like the lunacy or the untruth, because it's not just that. It's an alternative proposition about how politics is supposed to work or to be. And so factuality is at the beginning of all of this. And of course, to get people, and again, this is contra the libertarians, for all these libertarians who I know, it took so much social investment to create each libertarian, right? And like, the way that you become a libertarian is you grow up and you forget it, right? You grow up and you say, oh yes, I was just like somebody put an axe into, Zeus's head and I popped out, fully formed libertarian. No, right? The entire British Empire was needed to create John Stuart Mill, right? You have to have so much social investment to create that one person who then tells you that individuals are automatic. So to get to the factuality, you need the factuality to be a citizen, right? Being a citizen means that you're thinking about things for yourself. You're creating this little protective bubble around yourself, maybe sharing it with others. But to get there, you need the education. It doesn't come naturally. Okay, I'll stop there.